I'm gonna steal the Declaration of Independence.
Welcome back to the Millennial Classics, y'all. My name is Q, and on this channel, we talk about the best and most memorable movies, books, and culture-changing events from our generation. And for Black History Month, we are indeed reading Frederick Douglass's autobiography. I've got the actual autobiography, which is a lot smaller than I expected it to be. This dude lived an absolutely amazing life. And then I got like a special edition version. Beautiful covering. I don't know if this is real leather, but it has his actual autobiography in it, and it also has like other works. The one that like really just grabs me is the speech he made on the 4th of July, like the most famous Frederick Douglass speech. That's what we're talking about today. There are 4 major points that I thought that this book spoke to me in ways I can't even describe. This was one of the harder books I've ever had to read through. There were very few books where I had to actually put the book down because it was emotionally too hard to get through. I am like frustrated, shaking, mad, screaming in my head. It's unbelievable that the things that he was describing was happening to an entire people. We talk about slavery, we talk about it from a textbook, and it's like it's happening to so many people, it's hard to comprehend it as like an actual living thing that actually happened. But when you hear a man that lived through slavery describe the things he has seen and he has went through and the pain he had felt, it's heart-wrenching in ways that's hard to comprehend. It's a very difficult book to go through, but I do think it's mandatory reading. After saying all of that, the craziest thing is he writes so beautifully. It's almost like an oxymoron just reading how beautifully he describes the most hurtful things ever. Because of how great his writing is, it makes reading the book so much harder. I do want to jump off and give you one description of just the pain that I was going through reading this book. And it's a quote from the book when he was watching his Aunt Hester get whipped by his slave owner. And then I'll get into the major points as to why I love this book. And why I think love this book is a hard way to describe it, but I think it's mandatory reading. And this is one of the quotes that have really stuck with me. Before he commenced whipping Aunt Hester, he took her into the kitchen and stripped her from neck to waist, leaving her neck, shoulders, and back entirely naked. He then told her to cross her hands, calling her at the same time a dumb bitch. After crossing her hands, he tied them with a strong rope and led her to a stool under a large hook in the joist put in for that purpose. He made her get upon the stool and tied her hands to the hook. She now stood fair for his infernal purpose. Her arms were stretched up at their full length so that she stood upon the ends of her toes. He then said to her, "Now, you dumb bitch, I'll learn you how to disobey my orders." And after rolling up his sleeves, he commenced to lay on the heavy cowskin, and soon the warm, red blood, amid heart-wrenching shrieks from her and horrid oaths from him, came dripping to the floor. I was so terrified and horror-stricken at the sight that I hid myself in a closet and dared not to venture out till long after the bloody transaction was over. I expected it would be my turn next. It was all new to me. I had never seen anything like it before. I had always lived with my grandmother on the outskirts of the plantation where she was put to raise the children of the younger women. I had therefore been until now out of the way of the bloody scenes that often occurred on the plantation. I wanted to open with that scene because this was one of the first horrid scenes that he describes in this book. In the book, he says specifically, this is something that will never leave my memory until the day I die. And the reason, if you wanted to know, for this whipping, like any reason is sufficient for something this fucking brutal, this aunt was going to another plantation after the working day to go see another man. And that's another thing that you pick up really quickly from this book. Being a slave is one thing. Being a black woman in slavery is levels of insanity that is hard to describe. Not only do you get whipped and beaten like every other slave on the plantation, but number 2, the overseers, the master of the house, are coming to you to rape you day in and day out. You have these children, they get ripped from you, or they stay on the plantation, and then the mistress is obviously aware that this mulatto kid is not from one of the other slaves, it's from the master. So the mistress of the house is spiteful and hateful towards you because you had tempted the master. And she, the wife, can't do anything to her husband, so she takes it out on the person he had raped. And not just that, but her kids as well. The amount of hatred that boils up inside of you reading through stories like this, it is hard to comprehend. It is hard to believe that it was actually the reality for 240 years. Yes, this book has stuck with me in a lot of ways. So going down the 4 major reasons that I think this book is absolutely amazing, and number 1, the main reason is Frederick Douglass had lived an extraordinary life. In the beginning of the book, he says, if you were to judge the horrid shit that I had gone through as a slave, you have to understand that my life as a slave is a cushy life as a slave. As crazy and as horrible as the things that he had gone through, he was a slave in Maryland. He would always say the worst thing, worse than dying, worse than going to hell, was getting shipped down south, further south. That was the worst thing that could ever happen to a slave. During his life, he gets shipped over. He gets sent to live in Baltimore with his master's brother. The life of a city slave is much more cushy, depending on your owner, really, because he does talk about other slaves that he sees in the city that are living horrid lives, that are like literally dying of starvation. You never want to say, oh, you can't compare pain, but you really fucking can, though. And the life of a slave in the city that is Baltimore, horrible, but much more cushy than a life of a slave that was on a plantation, specifically down south. His slave master's wife starts teaching him the ABCs and starts teaching him how to learn to read. The master ends up finding out about these lessons and tells his wife, you absolutely can't do this, you have to stop. If you teach a slave how to read, then they can't be... Let me not put words in his mouth. I have to just give you the quote. He explains why learning to read was his path to freedom before he even knew that it was the path to freedom. Very soon after I went to live with Mr. and Mrs. Auld, she very kindly commenced to teach me the ABCs. After I had learned this, she assisted me in learning to spell words of 3 to 4 letters. Just at this point in my progress, Mr. Auld found out what was going on and at once forbade Miss Auld to instruct me further, telling her, among other things, that it was unlawful as well as unsafe to teach a slave to read. To use his words further, he said, if you give a nigger an inch, he will take an ell. A nigger should know nothing but to obey his master, to do as he is told to do. Learning would spoil the best nigger in the world. If you teach that nigger, speaking of myself, how to read, there would be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable and of no value to his master. As to himself, it could do him no good, but a great deal of harm. It would make him discontented and unhappy. These words sank deep into my heart, stirred up sentiments within that lay slumbering, and called into existence an entirely new train of thought. It was a new and special revelation explaining dark and mysterious things with which yet my youthful understanding had struggled, but struggled in vain. I now understood what had been to me a most perplexing difficulty, to wit, the white man's power to enslave the black man. It was a grand achievement, and I prized it highly. From that moment, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. I was gladdened by this invaluable instruction, which by the merest accident I had gained from my master, and the argument which he saw warmly urged against my learning to read only served to inspire me with a desire and determination to learn. In learning to read, I owe almost as much to the bitter opposition of my master as to the kindly aid of my mistress. I acknowledged the benefit of both. Super long quote, what stands in the way becomes the way. That is the true sentiment in Frederick Douglass's life in this incident, in the greatest personification of that statement. And from that day onwards, he decides, I'm not going to stop reading. The master's wife stops teaching him how to read. He starts learning how to read from white kids in the street. Whenever he goes on deliveries, he's like stealing newspapers. He's doing anything and everything he can to make sure that he is on top of this, and he's getting better and better and better. And throughout this time, his master finds religion. He becomes a much meaner master, and Frederick Douglass is not used to that kind of treatment, so he's pushing back on his master quite a bit. He gets sent to a slave breaker, and this is the first time in Frederick Douglass's life where he's actually a field hand, and they work Frederick Douglass to the bone. On his first time on the field, his master sends him to like take the ox and go grab some wood. He's never dealt with like livestock, and he messes it up, and he gets beaten and beaten and beaten, and then he's told that same day or that same night, go back to the woods and go get some wood. That was the closest he's ever gotten to wanting to commit suicide. He lost the fire to actually want to run away as a slave because he was worked to the bone known, like he was worked so hard. On his free times, he would describe his free days as sleeping under a tree in like some fucking stupor. He didn't even have energy to think and dream of freedom. But he gets into a situation where he's super sick. He gets beaten for being super sick. He ends up running away from the plantation to his regular master, like the actual master, because they're like 10 or 15 miles away, and tells his master, like, this is insane. I'm about to die if you send me back there. His master's like, you have to go back there. He goes back to the plantation, and this is when he decides to take his stand. And this is him as like a teenage boy. He's like, I'm not gonna just get beaten anymore. When Frederick Douglass returns, Frederick Douglass is like, if you try to beat me, I'm gonna beat you back. So they get into a legitimate fight, which back in the day, you hurt a white man, you die, you get hung. He does a really good job explaining how it's possible that had happened and he hadn't actually been killed by the law. The slave breaker didn't want to make public that he wasn't able to break a teenage boy slave because that would put a bad name on the slave breaker. He ends up never getting hit by slave breaker again. He finishes his time there. He gets sent back to Baltimore. He gets taught a craft, and it's called caulking. He ends up working for his slave master, never making any money. Whenever he comes back with money, he's supposed to give all of it to his slave master. This goes on for a few years, and then he's like, I have a craft. I know how to read. This is the best opportunity for me to find my freedom, and he finds his freedom. And that's the end of the book. But those are just the major things that stuck with me. Reading his autobiography, an extraordinary life. Thank God for Frederick Douglass, because his description of his life is horrifyingly beautiful. The brutality. I know it's weird to say that I liked it, but again, I go back to the sentiment that when I learn about slavery in school, when we watch movies about slavery, you feel so separated from the reality of it. You know, when you're reading about it and like the stats and the history and all of those numbers, it's so big, it's so huge that you forget that this is individual lives that people had to live through day in and day out, 24/7, 365, their entire lives. And just to explain that, yes, I do have another quote, and I think this is the kind of brutality that isn't just beatings, but the emotional and like the spiritual destruction of human beings is not better described than the way Frederick Douglass describes what slavery as an institution, as a system, as the law of the land has done to the life of a slave. If any one thing in my experience more than another served to deepen my conviction of the infernal character of slavery and to fill me with unutterable loathing of slaveholders, it was their base ingratitude to my poor old grandmother. She had served my old master faithfully from youth to old age. She had peopled his plantation with slaves. Let's just understand what he's saying there. Her offspring had multiplied the slaves on the slave owner's plantation. She had become a great grandmother in his service. She had rocked him in infancy, attended him in childhood, served him through life, and at his death wiped from his icy brow the cold death sweat, and closed his eyes forever. She was nevertheless left a slave for life, a slave in the hands of strangers, and in their hands she saw her children, her grandchildren, and her great-grandchildren divided like so many sheep without being gratified with the small privilege of a single word as to their or her own destiny. My grandmother, who was now very old, having outlived my old master and all his children, having seen the beginning and end of all of them, and her present owners finding she was but little value, complete helplessness fast stealing over her once active limbs, they took her to the woods, built her a little hut, put up a little mud chimney, and then made her welcome to the privilege of supporting herself there in perfect loneliness. If my poor old grandmother now lives, she lives to suffer in utter loneliness. She lives to remember and mourn over the loss of children, the loss of grandchildren, and the loss of great-grandchildren. To understand someone taking my kid, and I know that you're taking my kid to be a slave, would tear you to shreds. But not only does she go through this, but it's multiple of her kids go through this. She becomes a great-grandmother. All of those great-grandkids end up getting split up in that way. And not only that, the idea that she is not allowed to say a goodbye, I'll miss you, give them a hug, say anything. There's nothing that will change the destiny, as Frederick Douglass says, of her offspring. Through all of this, she is faithful and works for the slave master. And at the end of her life, when she's frail, when she has pains all over her body, they send her into the woods, they build a hut, and they say, "Best of luck, bye." The reason I'm reading so many quotes when I'm going through this very small autobiography is because he explains these things so beautifully. It shocks me that this wasn't mandatory reading in high school. And god damn it, it shook me to my core. Frederick Douglass does have a huge critique to Christianity. A big part of his critique to Christianity is, yes, number one, everyone knows there's slavery in the Bible, and everyone has their reasons as to why slavery is in the Bible. Frederick Douglass truly becomes a Christian after he's a free man. He decides to convert it to Christianity. But I think this is such a big deal, both to Frederick Douglass, and it makes a whole lot of sense to me, because throughout this entire book, he's harped on Christianity a ton, because he mentions the worst kind of slave master to have is the slave master that is a devout Christian. It's impossible for Frederick Douglass to believe someone who calls themselves a Christian would be someone who could own a slave and kill a slave and do all of the horrific, nasty, disgusting things that happen to slavery. He explains it so well, I'll just leave it at that. And I love how he questions it, because throughout his entire life, it's just truly obvious that those who have a reason besides them feeling like this is the law of the land, like a bigger reason, like a God's reason. God says that this is the reality, so that gives them the okay to be as brutal and nasty, horrific as possible. And then last but not least, that I think that this book is not just, I think it's a classic. The reason it is a classic and the reason it is a must read is because of its legacy and the impact of this book. This is probably the closest I've ever felt to understanding what slavery truly was. The amount that we talk about it in this country, you get years of study of slavery in America throughout your school years, all of that put together doesn't come close to me understanding what it was to be a slave than after reading this book. It is difficult, it is hard, but my goodness, it is necessary. I don't know how much of what happened during the time of slavery still lingers in this country. I have no idea. It is super hard to believe the great-great-great-great-grandchildren to the slaves that lived the life that Frederick Douglass is describing don't have lasting issues. Ladies and gentlemen, that is my review of this incredible book. I hope any of that made sense. Moving forward, though, for the next two books that I'm reading, I am going to do Invisible Man, Ralph Ellison. That is still segregation, and I don't know if that's right after, it's the Reconstruction. I'm not sure the time period, but Invisible Man is the next book. Faisal, my brother, gifted me Octavia Butler, so I'm going to read one of her books, just so we can get out of just slavery, because that's all we talk about when it's Black History Month. So hopefully for the next couple of book reviews, it's not going to be just the worst versions of Black history. Catch you on the flip. Deuces.